When I was a little boy, my grandmother would see me and she'd come over to me and she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. Then she'd let me go, and an hour later she'd see me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" I didn't appreciate that until I was much older. I went to see her when she was dying, and I was pouring my heart out because she really did mean the world to me. And I was holding her hand, saying all these things. It was time for me to go, and I stood up to leave. And before I left, my grandmother opened her eyes, and she squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you."
Welcome to That Moment When. I'm Steve Goldblum. We traveled to Montgomery, Alabama for today's interview to speak with attorney and social justice activist Bryan Stevenson, and I'm so glad we did. This was my first time in Alabama. We had been filming in Jackson, Mississippi earlier in the week and crossed over the historic Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma before arriving at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. Stevenson founded the organization in 1994 to provide free legal representation for people appealing their convictions or sentences. It also takes on any death penalty case in the state. The office is located on the site of a former Montgomery warehouse where Black people were enslaved. Its entryway is lined with a series of candid photographs of children in prison. They appear as young as 13 years old. And it is impossible to ignore these images. They simply level you. Stevenson worked for many, often frustrating years to persuade the courts to reconsider sentencing juveniles to life sentences. In 2012, the Supreme Court decided under the Eighth Amendment that it was unconstitutional to impose mandatory life sentences to minors. In his 2014 memoir, Just Mercy, Stevenson brings to life the stories of condemned prisoners who are months or years away from execution. We were interested in learning more about how Stevenson came to know and fight for these individuals. As you'll hear now, his journey begins with a family tragedy, a choice about that moment, and what to do with the emotions behind it.
I grew up in a poor, rural, racially segregated community. My grandfather lived in Philadelphia in the projects in a very low income and struggling area. And when he was 86 years old, some young men broke into his apartment and tried to steal his television while he was there. And he tried to prevent them from stealing it. And he ended up being stabbed to death, murdered. He and my grandmother had 9 living children. There were dozens of grandchildren. And this idea that someone that frail, that vulnerable, that harmless could be killed so violently was a very difficult thing. I remember, though, my grandmother and people in my family not asking, what kind of harsh punishment they wanted. They were asking questions like, how does this happen? What has happened to us that young kids would stab to death an 86-year-old man over a TV? And that contextualized a lot for me, the need to create a healthier community, the need to want more than what I saw in my community and what my grandfather saw in his.
Was there a moment where you decided to value redemption over revenge, and do you think that that informed what you decided to do with your life?
I've always had this idea that we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. That if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something, they're not just a thief. Even if you kill someone, I don't believe you're just a killer. And justice requires that we understand the other things you are. Because I've been judged unfairly. I've been presumed to be dangerous or guilty. I've had the police pull me out of my car and point a gun at my head and threaten to blow my brains out. And that consciousness will make you, I think, yearn for something that's closer to redemption, closer to rehabilitation, closer to reconciliation, closer to repair than what often is talked about in our policy and political discourse.
Can you describe the moment when you first visited death row and the experience that left you?
I took a course that required me to spend a month with an organization providing legal services to people on death row, and that's what got me to death row, and I was completely unprepared. But they asked me to explain to somebody that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. That was my task. And I went to Georgia's death row, and I was so nervous and distraught that when this man walked in, I was a bit overwhelmed. And what I remembered about him is just how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrist, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain him. And when they did, he walked over, and I began to apologize. I said, I'm sorry, I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know much about criminal appeals or procedure. I then said, they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I was surprised that when I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. And I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I would have an execution date. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife and I'm going to see my kids. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate to someone, showing up for someone, I couldn't believe the difference that could make in someone's life. We ended up talking for 3 hours because he just kept asking me questions and I kept asking him questions. And this amazing thing happened. The guards got angry. They came running into the room and they were treating him really roughly. I remember before he walked out of the room how that man planted his feet. And then he turned to me and he looked at me and said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then that man did something I've never forgotten. He threw his head back, he closed his eyes, and he began to sing. He sang, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And that radicalized things for me. That's when I realized I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground, but I also realized that my journey to higher ground was tied to his.
You know, you've talked about we kill broken people in this country. Can you explain the moment when you realized the power in brokenness?
We are so intent on shielding ourselves from exposing any of our vulnerabilities. It sometimes makes us cruel. It makes us abusive. And when I represent people on death row, I see the manifestation of that. I represented a man who was intellectually disabled, and we tried to get the courts to stop his execution because the courts have actually banned execution of the intellectually disabled. But because we have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, where wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes, this man couldn't get the legal assistance he needed. And when it came time for the day of his execution, and I found myself on the phone having to say to him, I'm so sorry, but I can't stop this execution, it was devastating to me. And the next thing I knew, this man was just sobbing on the other end of the phone, and I didn't know what to say. And then he tried to say something to me. He said, Mr. Stevenson, please don't hang up. He said, I've got something really important I want to say to you. And the last thing that man said was, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone, they pulled him away, they strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, I said, I don't think I can do this anymore. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had is, why do we want to kill all the broken people? And then I realized that I represent broken people. My clients are broken by poverty and disability and racism and dependency and addiction and hopelessness. And then I realized that I sometimes work in a broken system because the people with power are unwilling to get proximate. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of that agony, came this insight. What I realized that night, which I'd never realized before, is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that when you try to lift up human rights, when you're trying to help people who are suffering, who have been oppressed, who have been beat down, who are struggling with addiction and dependency, there are moments where you are overwhelmed, where you feel injured by the proximity to pain and anguish. It will break you. But that's also the night that I realized that there's a power among the broken. It's the broken that can teach us the way compassion works. It's the broken that understand the power of mercy, the importance of justice, the beauty of redemption. It's sometimes in brokenness that we understand how not only the human spirit, but the human body needs to be held, embraced like my grandmother would embrace me. And that has motivated me to keep fighting and to keep doing the work that I do.